This is Minutes of Horror Stories, episode 17. The Russian sleep experiment. It was the late 1940s, and the Soviet Union was embroiled in intense, top-secret military and scientific experiments. The government was pushing the limits of human endurance in its bid to surpass the West in every way possible. Among the most disturbing of these experiments was one that would come to be known as the Russian sleep experiment. It started innocently enough as a study of sleep deprivation, but it would quickly evolve into something far darker, something that would torment not only the participants but those who would later hear of it. In a hidden, underground facility far from the reach of international observers, 5 prisoners, men who had been convicted of heinous crimes, were selected to participate in an experiment that promised to be revolutionary. They were told that they were part of a scientific study meant to push the boundaries of human limits and were promised their freedom if they lasted. The experiment was simple. The subjects were to remain awake for 30 days with the aid of a new sleep-inhibiting gas that would be pumped into the chamber they were placed in. At first, the participants seemed eager to comply. They were locked in a small, sterile room, and the gas was introduced. For the first few days, everything went according to plan. The men were agitated and restless but showed no signs of anything abnormal. The researchers, observing through one-way glass, made notes about the effects of sleep deprivation, but they were not prepared for what would happen next. By the 4th day, the first signs of real trouble began. The men were no longer engaging with one another in the way they had on the first day. They became more irritable, more paranoid. They began to mutter to themselves, speaking in hushed tones. Their physical conditions started to deteriorate rapidly as well. Their eyes were bloodshot, their skin pale and clammy. They moved in strange, jerky motions as though their bodies were becoming disconnected from their minds. The researchers, though growing concerned, decided to press on. By the 7th day, the men were no longer speaking to one another. They had stopped trying to engage with the researchers through the microphone that had been placed in the room. They would simply sit or pace in the corners of the room, staring blankly into space. The gas continued to flow, and the men seemed to accept that they would never sleep again. But they were changing in ways the researchers could not have anticipated. On the 10th day, the first major incident occurred. One of the prisoners, a man named Dmitri, began screaming in terror. He shrieked that he could see things that weren't there, and he could feel something watching him. He started banging on the walls of the room, his body trembling with fear. The other prisoners, meanwhile, remained eerily silent, as if they were indifferent to his cries. Dmitri's outbursts became more frequent, and his physical condition deteriorated faster than the others. His eyes became wild, his breathing erratic, and his speech became disjointed. But the strangest thing was what he began to say during his episodes. He spoke in broken phrases, describing things that seemed impossible. "They're in my head. They're inside my mind. I can't stop seeing them. The shadows are alive." By the end of the 2nd week, things had escalated even further. The prisoners had stopped speaking entirely. Their behavior became more erratic, more animalistic. One man began tearing off his own fingernails, one by one, and licking the blood from his fingers. Another started to pull out chunks of his hair, stuffing it into his mouth as if it were food. They no longer made eye contact with the researchers, and instead, their eyes would dart around the room wildly, as though they were searching for something unseen. But it was on the 16th day that the researchers realized just how far gone the prisoners truly were. In a desperate attempt to understand the effects of extreme sleep deprivation, they decided to stop the experiment for a short period and allow the subjects to rest. But when they entered the chamber to administer the gas's antidote, they found the most horrific sight. The 5 prisoners had turned into something unrecognizable. Their skin was pale and gaunt, their bodies emaciated from lack of sleep and nutrition. But it wasn't their appearance that terrified the researchers. It was the condition of their minds. The prisoners had started mutilating themselves in grotesque ways. One man had gouged out his own eyes, while another had removed his ears and chewed them up. One prisoner had peeled off the skin from his own arms and legs, leaving deep, raw, bloody wounds behind. But the worst sight was the man who had taken a shard of glass and carved something into his own chest. "I can't sleep," before collapsing into a heap. Despite this, the researchers continued the experiment, though they had no idea how it would all end. After 23 days of non-stop wakefulness, one of the prisoners finally died. But it wasn't a peaceful death. The man had been found hanging from the ceiling, his neck twisted unnaturally, and his body covered in strange, almost ritualistic markings. His final words, which were barely audible, chilled the researchers to their core. "Sleep, the shadows are waiting." The remaining prisoners were too far gone to offer any answers. They had crossed into madness. They began to communicate with each other in guttural, unintelligible sounds, seemingly driven by an unknown force. They had become little more than hollow shells of their former selves. On day 30, the researchers finally decided to pull the plug. The gas was turned off, and the door to the chamber was opened. But there was nothing left in that room but the carnage and madness the experiment had wrought. The prisoners were no longer human, they were barely alive. In a final attempt to understand the cause of the deaths, the researchers opened the chamber, only to discover that the remaining prisoners had gone insane. They were in pieces. Some were still alive, though barely able to speak or move. Others had died in the most horrifying ways. The final report on the experiment was sealed away, never to be seen by the public. But the story lived on in whispers and rumors, growing darker and more twisted with each retelling. Some say the prisoners were used as part of a secret government program that sought to unlock the secrets of immortality. Others believe they were simply victims of an experiment that went too far, an experiment that should never have been conducted in the first place. But whatever the truth may be, the legacy of the Russian sleep experiment is one of horror, madness, and a disturbing glimpse into the darkest recesses of the human mind.